Started here. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Spencer Ruckty. I'm the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. We are very pleased to partner with The Shop, a wonderful bookstore in Honolulu for this virtual presentation with Mieko Kawakami in conversation with Katie Kitamura. They're going to be discussing Mieko's new book, All the Lovers of the Night, translated into English by David Boyd and Sam Bett. First of all, some of you have already found the chat window at the bottom of your screen, but I would invite you all to tell us where you're calling in from, say hello. And while you're doing that, I just want to say one of the true silver linings of the pandemic is being able to work with bookstores all across the country to put on virtual events like the one you're seeing tonight. It's especially wonderful to have this vehicle to highlight translated literature and to present authors and translators in conversation from all across the world. Third Place Books is really proud tonight to be joined by The Shop in Honolulu. We're so happy to put on this event thanks to the generosity of Kawakami's publisher, Europa Editions, who has always been a dear friend of independent bookstores. We're also incredibly fortunate to have a live interpreter with us tonight. Meri Joyce will be our interpreter from Japanese to English. As I mentioned, the chat window at the bottom of your screen is open, and we encourage you to use it respectfully. Tonight, we will also have some time for your questions. So if you have questions for either of our authors this evening, please submit those to the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, which is separate from the chat window. We're also going to be offering closed captioning for those who are interested. You can just hit the live transcript button at the bottom of your window to turn this feature on or off. A reminder that this event is being recorded, so if you miss any part of this conversation tonight, we'll be emailing that recording to everyone who purchased a ticket. Some of your tickets also include a copy of All the Lovers of the Night, which we'll be shipping out first thing in the morning. Now, without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Mieko Kawakami is the author of the internationally best-selling novel Breasts and Eggs, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year and one of Time's best books of 2020, and the highly acclaimed novel Heaven, her second novel to be translated and published in English, which Oprah Daily described as written with jagged, visceral beauty. Both of those books were translated by the superstar translating duo Sam Bett and David Boyd. Sam's credits include the works by Yoko Ogawa, Yukio Mishima, and David's work by Hiroko Oyamada and Hideo Furukawa. Born in Osaka, Japan, Mieko Kawakami's books are known for their poetic qualities, their insights into the female body, their preoccupations with ethics in modern society. Her books have been translated into over 20 languages. Joining Mieko in conversation is Katie Kitamura, whose most recent novel, Intimacies, received myriad rave reviews, as well as a selection as one of Barack Obama's favorite summer reads. Kitamura's last novel, A Separation, was a New York Times Notable Book and named a Best Book of the Year by over a dozen publications, translated into 16 languages, and is currently being adapted for film. Her two previous novels, Gone to the Forest and The Long Shot, were both finalists for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award. We have a number of Kawakami enthusiasts here at our store, and I know The Shop does as well, which makes All the Lovers of the Night a coveted staff pick, better than a National Book Award. Our bookseller, Sarah Cannon, wrote a staff pick for our shop and writes that Mieko Kawakami has the talent to quietly devastate, bringing a uniquely female voice to contemporary Japanese literature. I kept having to take little breaks to sigh and swell, taking in all of the beautiful, minute details of Fuyuko Irie's lonely freelance life and the sparse moments of companionship she finds with a kind but mysterious physics teacher she met under strange circumstances. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And with that, we are so pleased to have these two authors with us. Please join me in welcoming Mieko Kawakami and Katie Kitamura.
Hi, good evening, good morning. Thank you for Rogan and from around the world. 今日はよろしくお願いします. Great to be with you today.
Spencer, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And Mieko, it's such a complete thrill to be with you. And Meri, thank you so much for all of your presence and your help tonight. It's wonderful. I'm so thrilled to be here speaking to you about this book in particular. I love all of your work. But I found this book really incredibly singular and remarkably tender as well. I saw online that somebody was saying, you know, I just read the last 20 pages of All the Lovers in the Night and I've been sobbing for the last 15 minutes. And I had a very similar reaction. I just found this profoundly moving.
ありがとう。そんな風に、ご感想を伝えてくださってありがとうございます。率直に嬉しいですね。日本語はすごく、なんだろう、形容詞も多いし、修飾語も多くて、英語になった時にすごくこうシンプルになるっていう印象があったんだけど、やっぱりその限りではないんだなということを今感じてます。
Thank you so much for sharing these words and your impressions as well. I'm just really, frankly, so glad to hear what you've had to say. And Japanese as a language, it's a language that has a lot of sort of adjectives. It has a lot of quite peculiar sort of ways of expressing that. Often when it's translated into English, it's thought that it can seem quite simple in a way in the translation, but I can hear from your words that really the translation has been able to, you know, very much convey exactly what I was writing.
Well, I'm really hoping to talk to you later specifically about the translation process into English, especially because I know that your use of dialect in particular is very striking and is a big factor of your work. But I wondered if I could just start with this particular book. And, you know, I read it back to back with, I read it and then I went back and reread Heaven and then I went back and reread this again. And I realized that both novels begin with a point of contact. In the case of Heaven, it's the note that's left for the central character. And in the case of this novel, it's a phone call from her colleague who becomes her friend. And it feels like both these novels kind of turn around friendships, and often friendships between a kind of central character who's quite restrained in some ways and another figure who is kind of aggressively or is pursuing a relationship in a more forthcoming way. And I wondered what it was about that particular dynamic that interested you.
そう、ヘブンもすべての世の中の恋人たちも、やっぱりすごく、片やすごくいじめられていて、エクストリームな状況、もっと身体的にもひどい辛い目に遭っている二人が主人公で、すべての世の中の恋人たちは、高越者、大人の社会人の女性で、引っ込み思案ですごく、社交が苦手であると。で、置かれている状況の深刻さは違うんですけど、やはり私は、状態として非常に抑圧されている状態にある人や、そこにある感情を、どうしても書くというところからちょっとスタートするところがあると思います。
So yes, in both Heaven and All the Lovers in the Night, there, you know, in one of them, the two characters are placed in a very extreme situation of extreme bullying, including, you know, intense physical pain that comes along with that as well. And in the other, in Lovers, the character is, you know, working as a proofreader, you know, as an adult in this career as well, but quite a sort of internally focused person, not very socially skilled, socially adept in a way as well. So while they are in very different circumstances, I think the overall situation of, you know, the person who is being suppressed or oppressed in this way is really the starting point, and the emotions that come with that is where I have begun in both of those.
で、その中で、いろんな人間関係の中で、培われる感情とかリレーションシップがある中で、私はどうもこう、あれですね、友情をやっぱりすごく上位に置いているところがあると思います。
And within all of these different, you know, the human relationships and emotions and so on, I think that the position of friendship is really something that, you know, sits quite high for me.
I mean, in this book specifically, it's female friendship. And although I think in a lot of ways, the kind of romantic or the love narrative is very powerful in the book, in a lot of ways, it struck me as a book that's actually, the central relationship is actually between the two women.
そうですね。そうなんですよ。どうしても、こう、私は、そう、恋愛を書いたつもりではあるんですけれども、でも恋愛っていうものもすごくこう、細かく、それこそ、紐理論のように、こう、ずっとこう、なんていうのかな、細かく見ていくと、 なんか、どこからがいわゆるなんていうのかな、性的な恋愛で、異性愛で、どうせいろんなカテゴライズを私たちはしながら生きてるんだけれども、本当にそういうカテゴライズがないところでのエッセンスみたいなものが、どういう関係にもあると思うんです。
Yes, exactly. And, in Lovers, I did, of course, set out to, write about this romantic relationship. And there is, various, of course, the minute details that come as part of that. But we have this tendency of, whether it's, sexual relationships or between people of opposite sexes to categorize things in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that really it's in a place where that categorization is not there, that you can really find this essence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I one thing that I noticed, and I think you spoke about it a bit earlier when you said that these are characters who are in a position of being oppressed in a lot of ways, and they're often characters who have been placed into a position of passivity. But I think in both these, in much of your work, that passivity, the other side of that passivity is a kind of rejection of conformity, or it's a kind of act of refusal that has a great deal of power in it as well. And I wondered how you view passivity and power and refusal and all of those things, because it's not quite a Bartleby the Scrivener quality to it, but there is something very powerful in the way these characters either refuse or are unable to engage with the kind of social demands or the social expectations that are kind of surrounding them.
私はままならないとき、タフな状況に置かれているとき、で、それが外から見えることもあれば、誰にも共有してもらえない、外から見れば幸せそうに見えるけど、何が問題なんだって言われる場合もあると思う。でも、その人たちが置かれている状況ってやっぱり個別なんですよね。でその中で、一体何が、その人が生きることっていうことを持続させる力になってくれるのか。希望という言葉でもいいと思うんですけど、それが一体何なのかっていうことはいつも考えています。
So I think that when people are placed in this very, tough or challenging situations, of course, sometimes that can be seen from the outside, but sometimes there are times when that cannot be, shared with others as well. When people are looking in from the outside, the person seems completely happy, and people say, well, what's the problem there? Indeed. However, the problem there and these kind of situations are all individually different. Each one of them is different there as well. So I think that when we look at people like that, we think about where is it that they find this power that sustains them to continue to live, for example. It could also be expressed perhaps as hope.
で、それで私は人間が生きていくためにはたくさんのものが必要なんですけど、すごくその中で重要なものとして、記憶っていうのがあるんじゃないかと思うんです。
And there are, of course, many different things which are necessary for a person to live. But I think that within that, what is very important is memory.
で、記憶っていうのはトラウマとも同義だし、すごくネガティブ時にすごく苦しめるものでもあるんだけど、やっぱり人間が生きていく、未来を生きていく、何もない時間をこれから進んでいくときに、記憶との関係っていうのはすごく重要で、この小説っていうのもその記憶みたいなものにいろんなものが呼応してると思います。光のあり方、光が残り物である。誤色はどうしても残ってしまう。で、そういったものを、いろんなものをたくさん丁寧にディティールを積んでいくことによって、全体がそれを表してるみたいな、そういう、小説になったらいいなと思って書いてました。
And within that, of course, memory, it can be a synonym for trauma in a way. It can be something which really reflects this, suffering and pain in a sense as well. But for humans to, live and to be living into the future as well in this time, with nothing coming there and looking forward in that sense, I think that the relationship with memory is something incredibly important. And within this work, this is also entwined with various things such as the state or the nature of light, for example, or the fact that in any book, in anything, there will always be some kind of a mistake, some kind of an error contained in everything. And I think that within this book, I really wanted it to become a work where all of these things come together and accumulate together to form this whole and express it in this way.
There's so much in what you just said there that is so striking. I mean, I suppose maybe I'll start by touching on the question of hope. The novel does this really, and I don't want to spoil anything for anybody who hasn't yet read the book, but it does this really extraordinary movement in the final chapter, which I found profoundly moving and also very, very surprising. And it ends on what I would describe as a note of, you combine those two things. There is memory in the end, there is trauma for sure of what has happened to this character, and there is also at the same time hope. And I think in a span of something like 3 or 4 pages, all those things come together so beautifully. And you can see how trauma can shade eventually into memory, I think, for this character. And you can see that somehow through all of this, she has come through intact, and that there is this extraordinary strength within Fuyuko. So I wonder, I suppose that's not a question, that's more kind of saying to everybody in the room who hasn't already read the book, please read the book, because it is really extraordinary. But I suppose I'll ask, was that the end you always knew you were driving toward? Because in a lot of ways you skip the kind of moment of trauma that many writers would focus on, right? Many writers, there would be another 100 pages of this section that's kind of missing in the book. Did you always know that you would kind of jump over that and move instead to this kind of wonderful moment of resolution, I would maybe call it?
この小説は、これAll the Lovers in the Night っていうすごい美しい言葉になったんですけど、日本語ではすべて真夜中の恋人たちっていう、ちょっと一行詞みたいな、すごくね、助詞が抜けてるんですよね。
So in the English title of the book is All the Lovers in the Night, but the Japanese original title of it, it's almost like a one-line poem in itself as well. And it's actually, as a sentence, it's sort of missing part of the structure, actually. In the English, it sounds very beautiful in a sense, but the original Japanese has a bit of a different way that's expressed.
で、それで、私、この物語書く前に、このタイトルがずっと、メモしてあったんですね。そう。で、それで、なんかすごくすべて真夜中の恋人たちっていうタイトルにすごく自分自身が惹かれていて、でずっとそれを見ていた。まさに最後に冬子が自分のノートに書きつける。初めてあそこまだ読んでくれてない人いるからあれなんだけど、そういうやり方をしてますよね。で最後読み終わった時に、冬子自身の物語が始まるような、そういう物語になるだろうなということは予感してたんですけど、でも、すべてを決めて書いていたわけではなくて、まず最初にあったのは、タイトルだったんですね。
So actually, before I even wrote this novel, I had the title of the book in Japanese written as a memo, and I held on to that. I had that, stuck there for quite a long time. Actually, I was really drawn to the words that were contained in that title. And I'm sorry for those who haven't read the book yet, but at the end there is a scene where Fuyuko writes this quote, this sentence, as a note to herself in a sense as well. And this was almost the same as what I experienced. I had these words already that I began with. And so I knew in a sense that the way the book would end would be in a way Fuyuko's story starting from there. I had anticipated to that amount, but I hadn't necessarily, decided all the details and such of how it would end. But I really started out with this title, actually.
でも何もものすごく大きな出来事が起きないし、小説ってやっぱりなかなか物事が起きないと読者をずっと引きつけていくことが難しいなと思っていて、で、本当に地味な二人、ね、それを書いた当時もこんなに地味な二人が小説になるっていうのが、ちょっと自分でもどうなんだろうと思いながら思ってたところがあるんですよね。
But, usually within a novel, if, and in this work as well, it's not that there is necessarily anything, great events and so on that happen within the book, big things happening. And often it's sort of, you can think that it's difficult to keep readers engaged without, things like that happening within the plot, within the story. And the main characters there, so they're very, very plain in a sense. And at the time of writing it, even, I was even questioning, can characters this plain actually be, become part of a novel?
そう、それね、いくら地味な女の人が主人公って言っても何か一個ぐらいあるんですよ。なんかこう、一発逆転できるような、こう、ちょっとこう、なんていうのかな、ちょっとこう、で、何か、ちょっとね、でも、あそこまで本当に、こう、で、なんかこう、すごい誰かに見初められたりとか、何かすごくこう、出会っていくっていう風になっていくんだけど、本当に地味な人に地味な人が出会って、何も物語が動かなくってっていう。でも私はその炎で言ったら、青い部分、赤くなってない部分の青い真ん中の、もう本当に真ん中が一番熱いんじゃないかと思ってて、もう青白い炎で最後までもう描くっていうような気持ちがあったんです。
And so usually in a novel, if there is a main character who is, quite, this plain woman in a sense, often there'll be something about her. There'll be some part of her character which will be, that has the ability to completely change everything for her. Or she'll have this encounter with the other person that completely alters her circumstances. But in this case, both of these two main characters are both, very, quite plain, not necessarily standing out people in that sense. And there are also no big, events or happenings that happen within the book as well. But I think that I would like to compare this maybe to a flame, and rather than the red part, which is there, I always really think that it's that blue, almost blue-white light at the surrounding of the flame, which is actually truly where the heat is at its hottest.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, so much of the intensity of the book is in that nothing happening, is in these two characters who aren't able to make it happen between them in the way that we might expect from a more conventional narrative. I think in your previous response, you said something about finding mistakes and things, and that of course is part of her work. Her job is as a proofreader, and you open the book with a quite precise description of her job, of the income she's earning, of the kind of mechanics of making a living. And I suppose I have two questions, and I'll try to ask the first one first and then move to the second one. The first one is it felt to me like there was, and I don't know if I'm overreading this, but it did feel to me that there was a movement from her doing this work on other people's texts and correcting them and finding mistakes to, in the very end of the book, kind of writing these words for herself. And I think she says, it's the first time she feels like it's the first. I'm paraphrasing horribly, but it's like these words are for herself. They're her own. They're not in the margins of another person's manuscript. And I wondered if that was the case. And then my second question has to do with, this is a book that reminded me in some way of Yuko Tsushima's Territory of Light in the way that it is so. I don't know what the Japanese title is. I apologize. But in the way that it's incredibly close attention to details of class and gender in particular, kind of build into this very, very powerful statement about the state of a particular society and a particular moment. And I wondered how you thought about employment and work within the kind of employment, work, and class and precarity within the kind of structure of the book. So sorry, that's two questions in one.
ありがとう。そうそう、まずだんだん、あれなんですよね。まず誤植っていうあり方を、この小説書くときに取材に行ったんですね。その校閲者の人たちにいろんな取材をしました。そして、その中でたくさんいろんな興味深い話を伺えたんですけど、一番印象に残っていたのが、どんな本にでも誤植があるって言い切るんですよ。
So yes, indeed. I mentioned before about, the situation of mistakes or errors as well. And in the process of writing this book, I actually interviewed a lot of people who are working as proofreaders to learn about this. And within, there was many different interesting discussions and points that they raised. But the point which really left an impression on me is all of them really said that in any book, there will always be an error somewhere.
誰がどんなに時間かけて何人がかりで見たとしても、誤植のない本は存在しないって言われて、それってでも、どうやって確認するんですかって聞いたら、誤植っていうのは発見した時に存在するんだっていう、すごい全問答みたいなことを本気で皆さんおっしゃる。
And within that, they said, no matter how many people you have working, spending how many hours, there will be no single book existing that doesn't have an error somewhere in there. And really asking them about that, I said, well, how do you find that? How do you know that? And they said something which almost sounds like something Zen, but that the error only exists once it has been discovered.
でね、それってね、でも本当に私たちのこの存在するその物理的な、ものすごくその根本的なルールとちょっと似てるんですよね。量子力学的に。それが発見された時にそれが存在するっていう量子のあり方とも本当に似てるっていうか同じだと思ったんですよ。
And hearing this, it really made me think of, our very existence as well, as humans, and the role of, the physical or fundamental rules that are in place about our physical existence as well. And it's almost this element of, quantum physics in a sense. It's only when the atoms come together in this sense that they exist. I really felt that it was the same concept at play.
で、考えてみたら、そこからその高越者に取材した後に、私物理学者のところにいて、ちょっと授業を受けたりとかもしてて、それで光についても勉強してたんですけど、で、その時に、その光っていうものがよく分かってない。まだ人間のその科学や物理では光の正体をまだつかめてなくて、ただ分かってることっていうのは、私たちが見ている色っていうのは、本当の色ではなく、光が吸収して残った色を私たちが見ているっていう話を聞いたんですね。
And after interviewing proofreaders and so on for this, I also went to hear from people experts in physics and studied to learn about physics as well in the process of writing this, and within that to learn about particularly light. And through that process also learned that there is still so much that even with current today's science we don't know about light. There is so much about light which is a mystery, but what we do know is the colors that we see, the colors that we're surrounded by, they're not actually existing here in reality, but this is what's left behind by the light and absorbed there as well.
そうやって考えたら遺伝子みたいなものも残り物っていうことが考えられるし、でその私たちも例えばここにたまたま生まれてきたから世界があるっていうことをこう一体化できるんだけれども、生まれてきていなければ世界ってあったのかないのかみたいなこと、そういうことを子供の時から考えるのがすごく好きだったんですよね。
And so this is also the same as, genes are of course something which is, left behind as well, DNA. But ever since I was a child, I always really like to question and think about things like, well, we just happened to be born and are here in this world, and so the world is here existing. But if we hadn't been born, would this world actually be here? I was a child that was always thinking about these kinds of things.
で、だからそういう中で、冬子が、自分の言葉を、抑圧されていて、だんだんその校閲の仕事もままならなくなっていって、その中で自分のためだけに初めて文章を書く。それはすごく何かなんていうのかな、ポエジーな瞬間であると思いましたし、何かなんていうのかな、漠然とした、でももう決まっている世界の中で、一人の女性に見せられる、すごく、向こう側というか希望みたいなんじゃないかなと思いました。
And so to have to relate to your question about the error and Fuyuko having suppressed her own words for such a long time, but then she's unable to necessarily continue to do her work as a proofreader in the same way. And then at the end, she does, for this first time, write words for herself as well. There is this it's sort of quite a moment in a sense there as well, but within this ambiguous but also definite or certain world that we're living in, I really see this as the moment where she's able to sort of see the other side, to see hope in a sense.
で、二つ目の、ケイティさんの質問なんだけど、それに関しては、この小説を書いたときはね、ちょうどね、あれだったんです。非正規雇用の問題がすごく、これは本当にまずいぞっていうふうに日本社会がなってきた時だったんですね。
And as for your second question, Katie, the time when I wrote this novel, it was actually at a time in Japanese society where it was really starting to notice that the situation of what's referred to as irregular work or precarious work in a sense, that the way that was going was quite dangerous in a way. This was the time when it was being noticed in society.
で、同じ能力を持っていても、 正社員になるか、非正規雇用者になるかで、もう全く暮らしも、その人生設計も、まあ、主に経済なんですけども、人間関係も経済もガラッと変わってしまう。
And even with the same skill and ability, whether a person is employed as, a full company employee or in irregular work, even in the same place, completely changes the way that they're able to live, their life design, relationships, and particularly from an economic perspective.
だから、ひじりと冬子は実際ね、同じ仕事してるんだけれども、全くその保証のされ方が違っていて、で、それが、本当にフリーランスと正規雇用っていう問題が今ももうずっと、もうすごくずっと、ね、どんどん格差が、広がってきてるんです。
And the two characters of Hijiri and Fuyuko, while they are, working in the same career, the fact that one of them is working as freelance and the other as a full-time corporate company employee, they have completely different sort of security and guarantee in terms of their life and their work as well. And that's still the situation that is continuing now, and indeed the disparity between that is just growing greater and greater.
で、今は、MeToo 運動とか、フェミニズムをもっと若い世代の人たちが出てきて、生活の中で、学問としてだけでなく、生活の中で女性同士をエンパワーメントしていこうとか、もう黙っていないぞっていうことが共有されてきたんですけど、今から10年ぐらい前のこの小説書いた時は、もっと女性のカテゴライズがきつかったんです。結婚して、子供を産んで、キャリアを捨てた女性か、そういったいわゆる女の幸せを諦めて、キャリアに邁進している女性のこの、二つ、すごい女か偉い女か。だからすごいっていうのはキャリアもっとお金稼ぐ女がすごくて、子供を産んで育ててる女が偉いみたいな。この二つのね、コントラストがすごいきつい時代だったんです。まだ。
And so now there is, the Me Too movement or feminism and so on. There are more younger generations, women from the younger generation active in Japan, and not only as an academic issue, but really looking at actually within everyday life, how women can empower themselves, empower each other, and not remain silent. But 10 years ago, which is when I wrote this novel, it was a completely different situation. There was a much more strict categorization of women within society in Japan at that time as well, in terms of the expectations of you marry, you have children, and then you stop working, you give up your career. Or if you choose to continue your career, then you're giving up in a sense of, what was seen as, the female happiness, or the happiness that a woman should be pursuing in a sense as well. That women were sort of categorized in terms of one of these two kinds of women, either the good woman who pursues the family, or else maybe the woman who is, or smart woman who has a career but is giving up on the rest.
I just saw something in the chat about how we'll be moving to audience questions in a few minutes. So, and I feel like I've only touched on a handful of the things that I wanted to ask you, but I guess there's just 2 points I'd love to cover if possible before we turn over to the audience. One is about how you use language to think about class and gender specifically. And then maybe that might be related to the question of you have these two extraordinary translators who have done an incredible job of bringing, I think, both the complexity and the energy of your work into English. And I wanted to ask you about the process, because I think a lot of your, it sounds to me like a lot of the work you do is very specific to the Japanese language. Of course, these are tasks that translators deal with all the time. I think they've done a really, really exceptional job. So I just wondered what your relationship, how you worked on this text together. So.
そう本当に素晴らしい翻訳者と一緒に仕事ができたと思ってます。
So I really think that I've been able to work with really just excellent translators.
で、今回の本じゃないんだけど、ブレスタネアクスは、大阪弁で、全編がそうだというわけじゃなくて、大阪出身の3人の家族っていうのが、大阪で喋る。それが結構ダイナミズムがあったんですよね。
And not in this work, but in Breasts and Eggs, not the whole book, but particular parts of the book and the conversation between the three family members who come from Osaka are written in the Osaka dialect, which has a very particular sort of dynamism.
で、私とそのサムとボイドでみんなでこう、大阪弁をどういうふうに英語にしていこうかっていうことを何度か話したんですね。あと、スナックっていうスナック文化っていうのは日本特有のものだったので、3人でスナックとかにも行ったりしたんですよ。
And so I discussed quite a lot with Sam and David, the two translators, about how to portray this Osaka dialect in there. And not just the language, but even some of the parts of Osaka or Japanese society are quite particular as well. And there is what's called a snaku, which is the particular kind of sort of nighttime venue. We actually, the three of us went together to these places to, you know, see how we would portray it.
でそしたら2人がもう完全にもう楽しんで、変なとこなんです、スナックって。なんかみんなで知らない人たちで、なんかみんなで歌歌ってお酒飲んで終わるみたいな。そしたら、デビッドとサムがもう今まで生きてきた人生の中で一番楽しい夜だったって言ったんですよね。
And so a snack, or it's a snack but put in the Japanese, it's a place where people who don't know each other come together and they drink and sing and sort of chat, and then you just go your separate ways afterwards. Just these sort of small nighttime places. And Sam and David both said, you know, they completely enjoyed themselves when they were there. It's quite a strange place in a sense as well, but they said that it was the most fun evening that they'd ever had in their lives.
そうそう。それでね、大阪弁をどう訳すかって時に、私は、もうこれラップで行くしかないんじゃないかって言ったんですよ。韻を踏んでこうもう、ギャングスタラップっぽく行くかって言ったら、ケンドリック・ラマーみたいなとか言ったら、
And so when we were talking about how to translate this Osaka dialect, because it has such a particular rhythm to it as well, I said, well, maybe we need to go with rap, you know, maybe we need to go, you know, something like Kendrick Lamar in the way that we're doing it.
全然違うって言われて。
But they said, no, that's completely off.
ミエコ本当にごめん、全然違ってって言われたんですよ。
They said, Mieko, sorry, but that's really just not.
言ってて、それでどうしたかっていうと、なんかそのサムが言っててすごい、素晴らしいと思ったのは、やっぱ方言っていうのは、やっぱりその中央がその終焉に対して何かこう印象付けたい時の田舎っぽさとか、その、なんていうのかな、そういったものの象徴だったんですよね。例えばその、日本で言ったら、例えばなんていうのかな、いろんな地方の言葉があって、それちょっとやっぱりその、方言以上の、なんていうのかな、こう、勾配がついてるね。角度がついてるの。目線が入るんですよね。
And so when we were discussing about this as well, I think that for the dialects, more than just the words or the language itself, it really also looks about where the perspective is from. It's, you know, from the center looking toward the margins as well, in the way that, for example, to portray as something, you know, very rural or something, you know, very country bumpkin sort of sense in that way as well, which can be very symbolic. And I think in Japanese, for example, there are many different dialects throughout the whole of the country there as well, but it really, more than just the language, it comes with that gaze, the angle, the perspective there as well.
でも、大阪弁っていうのを考えたときに、必ずしも方言っていうことにその本質がないんじゃないかっていうことになったんですよ。
But when we started to discuss about this Osaka dialect, we thought that perhaps it's not actually the dialect itself, which is the fundamental part.
で、この気質であり、話すスピード感であり、で、悲しいことも、こう、笑いで回収したりする、その、なんていうのかな、こう、スタイル。
And more than that, it's also, perhaps more than the words, it's a style. It's about the speed of the language, the sense, when something sad happens, returning that or coming back with humor instead.
だから、どこか、その、英語の方言に当たるものを採用するとかっていうことにはもうならなくて、その、マキコとか、その、冬子、マキコ、夏子、緑子っていう3人がどんな生活をしてきたかっていうことまで想像してくれて、で、その3人独特の親密さみたいなものを話し言葉で、表現してくれたからですよね。それ素晴らしいと思います。
And so because of that, decided that rather than portraying the Osaka dialect in, you know, a different and equivalent other English language, particular regional dialect and so on, rather than that, decided to look at these three characters of Makiko, Natsuko, and Midoriko, and to really, and as translators, they're really imagining, you know, what life that they had lived until now, and seeing how through their conversation and through the language they were using to portray that intimacy between them.
だから俳優で言うとジェニファー・ローレンスがバーって喋る感じ、私も本当大阪弁にしか聞こえないんですよね。
So for example, if we take an actor, when I hear Jennifer Lawrence talking really, really quickly, it sounds like Osaka dialect to me.
大阪の商店街で聞いてシャバシャバシャバなんで、もう全部本当にこれもう本当にそういう何語かっていうことは関係なくてキャラクターなんだっていうことを本当に実感したんですよ。
And so I can really just picture her as, being someone in an Osaka shopping street saying, come on, and talking with this rhythm and this spirit and so on. More than just the language there, it's the character that comes through.
すべて真夜中の恋人たちで言うと、すごく2人の会話の中で象徴的な会話がすごい短いんだけどあって、冬子が2人三塚さんに言葉を聞き返すところがあるんですよ。
And in All the Lovers in the Night, there is a particular conversation between the two characters, Fuyuko and Mitsuka. It's a very short point, a very short conversation there. But actually, there's a time when she asks him to repeat something that he said.
2人が空の青さについて話しているところなんですけど。
And it's when they're talking about the blue color of the sky.
で、眩しいって言うんですよね。三塚さんが。
And Mitsuka, the character, says that it's mabushi, which means very bright or shining.
そしたらそれに対して、貧しいって聞き返すんです。
And she doesn't necessarily, or she asks him to repeat, and she says, did you say mazushi, which actually means poor in Japanese.
これは輝いてるっていうことと貧しいっていうことで、後の三塚さんの秘密に結構響いてくるところなんですよね。だから内心で三塚さんはすごくドキッとするような言葉なんです。貧しいっていう言葉が。
And so this difference between something being shiny or something being poor, it's actually something that connects quite closely to a secret that is being harvested by Mitsuka later on. And when he hears her asking in that way, it sort of shocks him a little bit in a moment.
でも貧しいっていうのを、じゃあ英語でどう置き換えたのかっていうと、それを相談したときに、彼らは、ブルーカラーとブルーカラーで返してきたんですよね。
But then when thinking about how to express that in English, this very particular difference between the two words there, the two translators, they came up with blue color and blue collar.
いや、これは本当に5秒で返してきて、もう本当にびっくりして、もう本当に音も再現できてるし、意味も、もう私の思った日本語とそれ以上の意味が入ってる。でね、やっぱ翻訳ってどうしてもどの言語からどの言語に行くときも原文から別のものに行くから何かが足りなくなるっていうような意識が無意識にあると思うんですよ。
And they thought of this in just 5 seconds, actually. They came up with this beautiful way to express it, which includes not only the meaning, but also really the elements of the sound there as well. And perhaps even going beyond what was in the original Japanese there as well. So I think that when we're talking about translation, of course, from any language to a different language, often there is a sort of expectation that in the translation there will be something lacking.
でもそうじゃなくて、でもやっぱりそうではなくて、翻訳されることで、なんかそのオリジナルの物語の良さとか強さが、こう、現れる瞬間というのがあるんだっていうことを彼らとの仕事を通して何度も実感しています。
But that's not the case at all, actually. Through the process of being translated, the original, these great parts of the original work or the strength of the original work actually becomes something new and great of its own in a sense as well. And there were so many moments in working together with the two of them that I was really able to experience this very directly.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And please, I mean, these translations are stunning, and if there's a way to convey my appreciation to Sam and David, please do. And I also want to say, Meri, thank you so much for the extraordinary work you've been doing all evening. Thank you. I'm sure everybody here is tremendously grateful, and you've just done a stunning, flawless job as well. I think it's now really time to turn over to questions from the audience, and I will just read them out. The first one, which came in, is: what advice would you have for women of color who are just beginning their writing journey? what advice from a mentor do you hold on to as a writer?
なんかね、英語圏、アメリカと日本でも、全然方法が違うと思うんですよね。で、だから、すごく日本は特殊な出版事情だし、私は大学も出てないし、文章を書く、勉強を一切受けてません。で、全然もう本当ストリートから、今、こういう皆さんに読んでもらえる立場になったんだけど、なんだろう。そういうシステムのこと以外で言うと、やっぱり、そうだな。ライターになるための、アドバイス。一旦じゃあそこまでやって。
So I think that the process or the situation for publishing and writing and so on is perhaps completely different in Japan and the United States in a sense. In Japan and my own personal experience, I didn't go to university. I've never studied writing or creative writing and so on. I really came, from the streets to now be in a position now to be, read by all of you. But other than the system, I'll think about what advice to share.
でも、やっぱり今 SNS がすごいんだけれども、すぐに SNS とかにやっぱり投稿して反応、リアクションを求めるのではなくて、リアクションのない状態を、リアクションがない中で自分のオブセッションとか、自分の表現みたいなものとか、自分の記憶と向き合う時間をできるだけ長く取った方がいいと思う。
We are now in a period with, social media, of course, as well, where there can be this tendency to want to write something, to post something and seek this immediate reaction from others as well. But I would really advise people to take as much time as you can to have this process of being in a situation or writing in a way where you're not going to have that kind of reaction, where you're not seeking that reaction, and rather than that, seeking out by yourself your own obsession, your own expression, facing up to your own memories.
多くの人の目にさらされることはすごく自分をさらしていくこと、自分の未熟な文章をさらしていくことは確かに鍛えられはするんだけど、でもね、やっぱ失うものもすごく多いと思う。
And within the process of having your words, things that you've written, read by many different people, exposing yourself in that way and having, problems with it pointed out or this sort of thing, of course that does train you in a sense as well. But I think there is also quite a lot that can be lost in that process too.
だから大事にすごく、自分の物語っていうのは本当に大事なものなんだという気持ちで消費されないように、何回も何回も読み直して、これだと思うものができるまで、私は自分の中で大事にした方がいいと思う。それぐらいかな、私ができるアドバイス。
So I think that it's really important to have, your own story and to hold your own story, to hold its place as well, not to be consumed by others in a sense as well, and to read it yourself over and over again until you feel, satisfied, you feel that you have, reached what you have written there as well. I think that's perhaps the advice that I could give.
Yeah.
The next question is, thank you so much for all the books you've written, and I look forward to reading this forthcoming title. Could you talk a bit about your creative process? Do you have any writing rituals that you regularly return to? And how do you get out of writing blocks? It'll be useful advice for me as well.
なんかね、私、今まだ子供が小学生で、いろんな行事とかがあって、もうほとんどそっちに取られるんですよね。本当に、もうちょっとびっくりする。それでね、あと、海外の出版のこともすごくたくさん増えてきてあるから、朝ので、私たちが寝てる間に、アメリカの人たちが一生懸命働いてくれてて、で私が朝起きたらそれのキャッチアップでね、お昼ぐらいまで、ずっとアシスタントと打ち合わせがあるんですよ。で、そうすると、子供の学校にお迎えに行くまでの間って大体ね、4時間ぐらいしかない。4時間なのね。で、4時間のうちになんかやっぱりご飯も食べるじゃん。そうすると、私の時間って3時間なんですよね。3時間しか執筆の時間がなくて、でも3時間全部集中できるわけじゃなくて、ちょっとダラダラもするから、なんか結局、でも、めちゃくちゃ書いてるんですよ、私。早いんですよ。すごい早くて。
And so I have a child who's now in elementary school, and there's so much time which is being taken up, of course, by school events and all of this kind of thing as well. Surprising, how much time is actually really taken by that. And because now I'm doing a lot of work with publishers overseas as well. It's while we're sleeping here in Japan is when everybody in the United States is working hard, and so I'll wake up in the morning and catch up on everything that has been happening in the last overnight. Spend probably until lunchtime in meetings or discussing with my assistant to catch up with everything in that sense. And then I'm left with about 4 hours until I have to go and pick up my child from school. And so, of course, in that 4 hours, you also have to eat. And so that means maybe 3 hours that I have left for myself and for writing as well. But as to whether I'm actually, focusing and concentrating for that whole 3 hours, of course, that's not the case. There's parts within that where I'm, not able to do that as well. But I write very, very quickly.
で、コツは、もうちょっと書きたいなと思うところで、その日は切り上げるんですよ。
And my trick, or the way that I do that, is I stop writing for the day at a point where I really want to write a little bit more.
あと、テーマソングを決めておく。
And also deciding the theme song.
そう。もう気持ちが乗らなくても、その曲をかけたら、こう、そのムードに助けてもらう。
And so even at those times when you can't really, there's nothing where you're finding that you're not able to write, by putting that song on, bringing you into the mood that you have to.
その2つでなんとか15年ぐらい乗り切って。
So they're the two tricks, or the two things that I've somehow managed to use to get through these 15 years.
Those are two really good tricks. The music one is a really good one, because I feel like so much time is wasted getting back into the mood and you've only got 3 or 4. I mean, my schedule is exactly like yours, and it's like 3 hours a day to write, and I spend an hour trying to get into the mood, which is I'm going to try the music trick tomorrow, in fact.
本当に入ったら自動的にこう行くから。
Music is great. When you put it on, it just sort of automatically drags you into it.
ぜひ試してください。
Please try it out.
I think we probably have one more time for just one more, or maybe 2 more questions. Or, oh wow, there's a lot of questions. What, with this particular piece being written about 10 years ago, what was the writing revision process like? Has the way in which you read and experience your own work changed over that time?
そうですね。そうそう、翻訳を機に、こう自分の作品とかしっかりまた読み返したりとかしたんですけど、やっぱり、うわーっと思うところありますよね。うわーっていうのは、なんで同じことを繰り返してるんだとか思う、ちょっと、とか思うところある。やっぱり、若いなって思うところはありますね、若干。
In the process, or when it was being translated, of course, I went back and reread my work as well. And there's moments in there where I'm reading and I just think, why was I repeating that same thing twice here? And reading it, I really just feel that I was very young, I think.
でもね、一番やっぱり大事なのは、みんな生きるっていうのは恥をかくことだから。
But the most important is, of course, living itself is a process of, experiencing shame in a sense.
で、大事なのは、その時、絶対に手を抜かずに、その時の自分で全力でできることをやったっていう記憶なんですよ。
And I think what's really important then is to remember that, of course, while there might be things that could have been done differently, remembering that you put everything into that you put all efforts that you could.
これ以上のことは、できなかったっていうことは自分にしかわからないじゃん。で、これがやっぱり大事なんですよね。あの時も私はもう全力でやったからもうこれ以上はできなかったっていう感触があるから、こう次の作品に恐れずにいけるんだと思うんですよ。
But of course, it's only you yourself who is able to judge, to know that you did put everything into it as well. And it's only you that can really know that that was indeed the maximum of your capacity there as well. So I think it's holding on to that memory and recognizing that is what makes me able to be, going on to my next work without fear.
だから、それはね、やっぱりね、評価されたこととか、たくさん売れたとか売れなかったとかっていうこととは全く違う軸のね、すっごくね、表現者にとってね、大事なパーソナルな、価値なんですよね。
And so I think rather than, how much the work was praised or how many copies sold or didn't sell, it's a way that it's on a completely different axis. It's something so important for an artist, for someone who is working in the realm of expression, about this very personal way to look at these works and to evaluate, to judge.
だから、それさえ、しっかり自分で持っていれば、ね、いろんなことがあるけど、また次頑張ってみようと思えるし、そうなるんじゃないかな。
So I think if you really keep that to heart, to yourself, and keep sight of that as well, it means that, well, there may be different parts within it. It enables you to be able to, continue to move on and to progress to the next.
Spencer, do we have time to do a couple more questions?
Absolutely.
Or do you want us to wrap up?
No, one or two more questions would be great.
There's so many great questions here. One is, what does conveying messages to wider readers via other languages mean to you? How is it different from conveying messages to Japanese readers with your own language?
そうね、なんかやっぱりすごいね、基本的に不思議なんですよ。
On a very basic level, it's a very strange thing in a sense.
やっぱりさ、翻訳ってやっぱりすごい、さっきお話ししたみたいに、わかる、理屈としてはわかるんだけど、でも、こう、模様として全然違うわけじゃないですか。
And, as we were discussing, translation, of course, is something which you can understand as a logic, but it's a completely different, design, a completely different impression.
だから、本当にね、そう、翻訳でその物語が共有される、違う言葉で共有されるっていう、で本当にそれってやっぱり、なんか言語のあり方の謎に関わるっていうか。
And so the idea, the concept of, works being translated and shared with people in this different language, I think it's really related to the very nature of, language, of words themselves.
だから意味を多分みんな基本的に共有すると思うんですけど。
And so, the meaning is, of course, in this fundamental sense, shared between readers in different languages.
そう、エッセンスの部分としてはそういう驚きが常にあるんですが。
And as an essence of that, there's always that surprising factor.
でも、なんかその、内容的に、物語内容的に言うとやっぱ感じてることがあって。
But there are certain points which I feel in regards to, the content of the story.
なんか、やっぱりね、これまではね、日本ってイコール東京だったんだよね。
And I think until now, people's image of Japan, it equals Tokyo.
で、その東京っていうのはみんなそれぞれイメージを持ってくれてると思うんだけど、例えばすごくちょっと歌舞伎町とかクレイジーなものがありながら食べ物が美味しくって、で、みんな同じぐらい幸せで、なんかみんながこう同じクラスの、で、オタクがいて、キティちゃんがいて、みたいな、なんかこういうね、すごく、なんていうのかな。そういう印象があったと思うんですよ。あるいはその逆に芸者とか、富士とか、桜といったそういうちょっとこう、トラディショナルな、こう、イメージがあって、それが共存してる、ちょっとね、ちょっとこう、キッチュだというかね、こう、空気な街。それが日本っていうイメージがあったと思う。
So I think people either have, this image of Tokyo, which is very widely shared, which is, they see the crazy side of Tokyo in, kabukicho, the bright lights, or delicious food, everybody being about the same level of happy, but also everybody being about the same class. And then there are, the otaku, there's Hello Kitty, or there is this traditional image that people have of Japan, the geisha, Mount Fuji, the cherry blossoms. But both of these have in common really being a little bit, kitsch or quirky in a sense.
で、やっぱりその中で、でも、それは悪いことばかりじゃなくて、やっぱり遠くの文化とか遠くの人たちを想像するときの手がかりにはなるし、私もそういう遠い国の文化とか文学に対してはそういう手がかりは絶対に持ってると思うんですよね。
But that in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. In order to, encounter or to understand a culture which is far away from your own, of course, you need these things to sort of cling on to, in a sense, to learn about or to become familiar, in a sense.
でも、ブレスタンド X を出したときに、なんだろうな、これまでも、日本の女性の労働、なんていうのかな、 女性について女性が書いた小説は日本もたくさんあったんだけど、あんまりそれが求められてなかった。でも、ようやくその欧米の人たちが、日本の女性の、なんか、生々しさみたいなものに、やっぱ関心を持ったっていう、なんかフェーズが変わったのを感じたんだよね。2020年前後。この5年ぐらいの間に。
And I think at the time when Breasts and Eggs was published in English, well, until now, of course, there are many works, Japanese literature written by Japanese women as well, but they weren't necessarily, sought out in a sense as well. But I think it's just in these past maybe 5 years or so that I feel that readers or in the sort of the English-speaking world are seeking out these, this sort of gritty reality of women as well in that sense, and they're starting to be interested in that. So I think it's really entered a new phase, perhaps from around the year 2020 or so.
だから日本にも階級があって、クラスがあって、貧乏な人がいて、なんかヤクザみたいな、そういうアウトローの人たちとストリートの生活があったんだねって言われて、で、なんだ私たちが毎日苦しんでることと、なんか同じじゃんと。で、自分たちの、なんか遠くにあるものを鑑賞するのではなくて、自分たちの体験とすごくミックスして物語を受け取ってくれたっていう感じがすごくありました。
And so I think that through this coming out, I think people are seeing, when they're looking at this portrayal of Japanese women, or, that in Japan, class does exist. There are poor people in Japan, and there is this everyday life that's there, behind these, the outlaw or the yakuza on the streets that are seen as well. But I think this meant that readers could see, oh, our suffering, we share the same kind of suffering. And it's not just about experiencing a story of something far away, but really bringing what is in that story and mixing it in with one's own experiences.
That's so beautiful. And it's such a delight. I could listen to you talk all night, but Spencer, I know that, and I apologize to the attendees because there's so many wonderful questions which we weren't able to answer, but I know, Spencer, we're very short on, we've already run over. So I suppose at this point I should say thank you so much for hosting us and for letting me talk to one of my favorite writers in the world, and
oh my God,
and then hand it back to you.
Pleasure's all ours. Yeah,
I had a great time. Thank you, Katie.
I loved it. Thank you so much.
And today's an incredible try.
Yes, thank you.
For Meri. Yeah, she's amazing.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, you're wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Meri. Thank you, Mieko. Thank you, Katie. Thank you to everyone who showed up tonight. Thank you to the shop and Yvonne, who you saw, I think, briefly appear on screen earlier. We are just so pleased to have this event and to support translated literature. Please go out to your local bookstore, purchase a copy of All the Lovers in the Night, translated by Sam Bett and David Boyd. We will be, like I said, shipping books out soon for those of you who purchase book bundle tickets. And other than that, please have a wonderful evening and please be well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Spencer and Katie.
Thank you. Yes, I hope so. Thank you.